Hi there, welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh. This is Gizmo and Widget, my travelling companions. And welcome back to our series, Hidden Gems in the Cotswolds. We're travelling on your behalf through the centre of the Cotswolds, seeking out smaller places you might easily not come across, little villages, churches, even the occasional artefact. Come with us and let's go and find some wonderful Cotswold gems. It's a beautiful spring day. The sun is shining. It has that wonderful effect of lighting up the tops of the hills in the distance. Our spirits are very high. And behind me you will see one of the great Cotswold manor houses, Little Wolford Manor. There's a lot of building work going on here, so some wonderful restorations are obviously taking place. We're going to tell you a little bit about it. We're going to show you around the one or two lodges that are worth looking at. And then we're going to move on to Great Wolford. Evans dropped in here just briefly in 1905, as this Warwickshire manor house is a brilliant example of 15th century country house architecture. Fortunately for us, it's visible from the road, as unlike in Evans' time, you can't just bang on the door and ask to be shown around. Frederick Griggs's illustration of the house is particularly good, and Evans writes as follows. Just beyond Weston, on the further side of the Shipston Road, is Little Wolford, famous for its interesting 15th century manor house. You may make an afternoon's excursion there from Brailes, or take it in on a ride to Forshire Stone, which marks the meeting place of the shires of Gloucester, Worcester, Warwick and Oxford. The manor house is of the typical form characteristic of its date, a hall in the centre with a projecting wing on either side. One of the wings has been pulled down. The remaining one is of stone below and half timber work above. The central part is all stone. He goes on to say, in the hall, which preserves its screen and gallery, hang rusty weapons and accoutrements, and a curious instrument of iron, which the farmer's wife tells you is an eel drag, with which the eels were dragged up from ponds. She will also affirm that King Charles dined in the hall, and will show you the oven in which he was concealed from his pursuers. You may believe as much of this as you like, but you will refrain from hinting at your scepticism to your guide, or you may miss the draught from the chalybeate spring down in the field behind the house with which your departure is graced. These short paragraphs tell us so much about the way life has altered over the last 100 years. You certainly can't just bang on the door of a country house and ask to be shown around. If you did, you would, understandably, be given short shrift. I also very much doubt the hall is filled with rusty weapons, relics of a time that we, fortunately, have felt able to relegate to the mists of ancient history. It's much more likely that it's been made into a huge kitchen dining room with a granite-topped island in the middle. But we will never know. In a wall on the roadside by the manor house is a public drinking fountain, set in a recess partly made up of architectural fragments, including pieces of 15th century windows and a number of early 17th century carved stones, one of these being a broken shield of Rafe Sheldon, impaling Throckmorton. I wonder if the new owners are even aware that they have the privilege of a chalybeate spring on their land. A chalybeate spring, for those of you not too familiar with medieval English, means a natural mineral spring containing iron salts. If they are, and perhaps they will be now, I hope they will use their undoubted influence to ensure the water from this natural gift is appreciated and kept pure on its course to the rivers. Some of you may remember when we were in Hampnet, just south of the A40 trunk road, we discovered a fresh spring spouting from the ground and flowing crystal clear down the valley. At the time, I mentioned I'd joined a group called WASP, an acronym for Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, because I was perfectly aware even then that the wonderful clear spring water gushing from the hillside would be so polluted just a few miles downstream that I wouldn't let my grandchildren swim in it. Today, my friends, the 10th of March 2023, I am in a state of such anger I can barely speak these words. I have just had a text message to tell me that after an entirely normal few days of gentle rain and showers, with no sign whatever of exceptional circumstances, Thames Water, our local water company, are pumping untreated human effluent into our local waterway, the Shilbrook, supposedly under the regulation that allows them to do so in an exceptional emergency. The fact that they are allowed by law to do this, that the whole system is entirely self-policed, that however hard I try, I can't find any reason why, if it costs them money to do so, the water companies should be motivated properly to look after our most basic human requirement, sends me into a very uncharacteristic gloom. We really are going to have to do something about it. Just as a starter, perhaps, you might help me and support WASP a little. Their website is windrushwasp.org. If you are local, consider joining, or indeed if you're not. And perhaps send a few pennies to their fund. We will try hard to make a difference. I don't need to explain to you, who listen with interest to me describing some of the most beautiful countryside in the world, that our waterways are fundamental to our very existence, let alone our pleasure and the health of our countryside. But enough now. This compilation of short films we've made over the last few weeks continues with our next stop very close by. We're setting off up the road to Great Wolford, where we filmed on a day when I was very much less cross. This is a peaceful place, certainly not a place you would normally come if you were simply travelling this region. It has a lovely feel, and we're going to show you around. Come with me. It's such a brilliant spring day, it's clear that pretty soon I will have to leave my lovely Akubra hat behind and bring out the trusted Panama. Ross and I are planning all sorts of lovely things for the summer, not least a series on great homes in the region. Meanwhile, however, we are just mopping up a few lovely little gems mentioned in our trusted companion, Highways and Byways in Oxford and the Cotswolds. Herbert Evans, who wrote this lovely book in 1905, has been an extraordinary inspiration for us for the last 5 years, taking us on his cycle ride around the hills and valleys of the region. His amazing historical expertise and his light touch when it comes to the stories he enjoys and the way he tells them has helped us to create the Cotswold Explorer in a similar vein, perhaps even in his image. We haven't followed him exactly over the years, so we have missed a few treasures on the way, and now we can pick up a few of the little places we've bypassed. By the way, we will shortly be publishing our own edition of his book, illustrations and all, as well as an audio version read by me. It perhaps won't surprise you to know that if we miss the deadline we set ourselves of the Ides of March for the publication, it'll be entirely my fault. Ross is doing a brilliant editing job, but my reading and final copy editing is always behind schedule. I promise, however, we will make it in the end. Great Wolford, where you find us today, is actually not mentioned in Evan's book. Little Wolford and its manor just down the road most certainly is, and we will be telling you a little more about that extraordinary house next week. But coming here, we couldn't resist visiting the larger of the two villages to see what it has to offer. And we're glad we did. The name Wolford, perhaps unexpectedly, apparently derives from the Old English word wolf, with weird, meaning place protected against wolves. This unusual, possibly even unique name is thought to suggest that the settlement had some kind of physical arrangement to protect themselves and their livestock from packs of lupine marauders. The village lies at the junction of two roads, one from Moulton in Marsh to Chipping Norton, and the other from Barton on the Heath, and it's possible to see some of the original earthworks by which it was surrounded, presumably the remnants of the wolf protection. The houses are mostly of the local Cotswold stone, which in this area is very yellow compared with some. We've come across this mineral-induced colour many times before. In the 13th century there were mills in this village, one a fulling mill and one a corn mill. They were almost certainly situated on the Nethercote Brook, which bisects the valley. Neither shows any signs of their presence today. There was a church here from 1177 at the latest, but in 1835 it was completely demolished, for reasons I'm unable to determine, and rebuilt to the design of a famous architect called James Trubshaw. Trubshaw had built what at the time was the largest single-span stone bridge in the whole world over the River Dee at Chester, called the Grosvenor Bridge. It is thought that he was in the vicinity building a big house at Weston Park for one Sir George Phillips, and took on this church as a kind of sideline. It has an extremely high spire over a sturdy tower, which houses 6 bells. They were rehung in 1991 and are regularly rung by the local team, as well as visiting bell ringers. The east window has some rare and interesting stained glass by a German company called P.G. Heinersdorf & Co., and is thought to be the only example of their work in Britain. Somehow the window complements the inside of this church, which is almost barn-like in its proportions, and I have no doubt its serried ranks of pews have held many a huge congregation for weddings and funerals. It has an interesting tiled floor, a reasonably interesting font and pulpit, but it has a utilitarian feel to it that is rather unusual in this part of the world. The village is clearly a busy and successful settlement, but if you look closely, you see some quite serious cracks. The cottages are obviously much loved by their occupiers, well tended and neat, but right in the middle of the village is a large and completely derelict farmyard, full of rusting machinery and falling down barns. It's a surprising thing to find in a place where every square foot of land is potentially worth a small fortune. We have absolutely no idea of the story behind this situation, but both Ross and I felt a strange sense of relief to see at least a small part of the Cotswolds that hadn't been developed to death. I doubt it'll last long, but for the moment it was strangely refreshing. We had thought to film this village's streets from the top of the car, as we have in other places in the past, but despite the sun, it was so cold that I couldn't face Ross's blue hands. Driving round the place, however, was a pleasure, and I, for one, will be coming back here in a year or so to see what progress has been made. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Great Wolford. Its golden stone, its very tall church spire, and the weird contrast between these very neatly kept houses and an almost derelict farmyard in the centre of the village. It's an interesting contrast. We've enjoyed it here a lot. We're dropping south now, about 15 miles, to a place we visited once before ages ago, but deserved a new examination. It's Farmington, in Gloucestershire. The village sits at the top of a ridge surrounded by valleys cut over the ages by water and ice. It's a sleepy place with a fine manor house behind high walls, and the little roads that run through the place are single track, often with gates and cattle grids, speaking of an old-fashioned stock-rearing system. Much of the old Cotswolds is still crisscrossed with these gated roads, which stem from the time when sheep outnumbered the people by a factor of several hundred. Evan's description of the village itself is rightly enthusiastic, and it reads as follows.
Between Northleach and Burford, and in fact all the way to Witney, the main road keeps to the summit of the ridge, which conveniently lies east and west. That's the famous A40 that we have met so often. But down below the road on the left is a charming valley, the hiding place of many a bright, sunny village, each a cluster of well-stored farmsteads, orchards and cottage gardens. While here and there the spreading oak and elms of a deer park indicate the dwelling of the lord of the soil. For the first 3 miles of its course, this valley is watered by a nameless stream, which joins the Windrush near the village of that name. At this point, this river, which has hitherto taken a southerly course, turns abruptly to the east, and our valley is no longer nameless. Up then, over the hill to Farmington, and we soon descend again to the water's side. As for Farmington itself, it is a pleasant, well-to-do village, embosomed in trees, with a green whereon 3 aged sycamores shade the pretty thatched and gabled shed which covers the village spring.
On the triangular village green today, one of those magnificent trees is still standing, and where the other 2 used to be, 2 more have been planted for future generations to enjoy, given time. The small building over the well in the centre of the green is still there, but in 1935 its thatched roof was replaced with local stone tiles, courtesy of the inhabitants of Farmington in Connecticut, USA, to mark the tercentenary of the foundation of their state. Now that's a kind and generous thing to do. Farmington, Connecticut is obviously a thriving community. Originally inhabited by the Tunxis Indian tribe, in 1640 English immigrants established a community there, making Farmington the oldest inland settlement west of the Connecticut River and the 12th oldest community in the state. Settlers found the area ideal because of its rich soil along the floodplain of the Farmington River. Sounds quite familiar. Even today, European connections are very strong in Farmington, USA. One of the largest employers in the town is a German industrial machine manufacturer called Trumpf. I suspect the church in our Gloucestershire Farmington is very little changed in the last 100 years, so I'll read to you what Evans has to say about it. As you will hear, he isn't particularly excited about the building. Indeed, his comments are short and a little brusque, but it has some interesting features which I will describe in a little more detail.
The church has suffered from modern excrescences in the way of organ chambers and vestries, and at some time the north wall appears to have been cut through to form the present lean-to north aisle. As you stand in the aisle and look upwards, you see the old external corbel table above the arches. Then a delightful lane by the brookside takes us to Sherborne.
After that cursory description, I can tell you a little more. It's a Norman church of nave and chancel, to which the north aisle of which Evan speaks was added in around 1200, and a west tower around 1500. The embattled tower is in 3 stages, with rather lovely painted stone clock faces to the west and east. It has to be said the north aisle was rather badly redone by Waller and Son in around 1890. I suppose when Evans was here it was quite recent and therefore even more irritating. The chancel arch has some elaborate chevrons, and 3 attached jam shafts, and similar decorations can be found on the south door, protected by the porch. The altar is of local stone, probably quarried about a mile north of the village, where stone is still taken from the ground for ornamental purposes. If you take the little gated road from the village green going south across the valley, it will take you to the quarry. It's well worth a visit. There's a good octagonal font from the 1780s and an early 18th century pulpit, and a really good Art Nouveau brass lectern by Omar Ramsden and Alwyn Carr, made in about 1910. In the churchyard, just west of the tower, there's a huge mid-19th century tomb to the Waller family, which I'm afraid I couldn't resist walking onto. I bet you can't resist it either. There's something reassuring about this village. We're not far from Burford, where, as I've said, only a mile from the big A40 trunk road, and yet this place seems untouched, really, by the outside world. Come here and explore the lanes and the valleys that surround the place, and you'll get a pretty good idea of what it is that makes us love this part of the world so much. Another 10 miles or so south now to the village of Quenington. This'll be fun. Floods, ancient religious orders, and amazing architectural details.
Now we're right in the centre of the Colne Valley. On a beautiful day, midwinter, there's frost all around, but most of all an enormous amount of water. It's extremely rare that you see the valley of the Colne in this kind of state. That's quite exciting for us. But we're also in a lovely village which has ancient connections to the Knights Hospitaller, and we're going to show you around. Come with me.
Ross and I have spent a couple of days recently filming the flooded valleys of the Cotswolds, as well as the Thames Valley near Bampton. We're at the beginning of 2023, just in case you're watching this sometime in the future, and the rains have been continuous and heavy. We approached this village of Quenington from different directions, parked outside the Keeper's Arms, and regaled each other with tales of rivers crossed, icy slopes, and all kinds of other excuses for being late. The last time I was in this village, it was midsummer, and my family and I had decided to take a picnic at the side of the River Colne, between here and Colne St Aldwyn. The footpaths along and around the river are some of the most beautiful in the whole Cotswolds, and we had an idyllic afternoon, walking in the sunshine, far further than we had intended, and picnicking in the long grass, watching the herons fishing in the river. Our return to the village and to this lovely pub was extremely welcome for weary human feet and exhausted dogs. We were welcomed with warmth and kindness by the landlord, despite the ravages of COVID around at the time. On this occasion, I had forgotten that he closes for the whole of January every year, so sadly no lunch nor even a pint today. The village, however, does not disappoint. As we will discover, the settlement owes its existence to the establishment of a preceptory here by the Knights Hospitallers. The Hospitallers were a Roman Catholic order, their full title being the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. They arose in the early 12th century, during the time of the Benedictine reform movement known as the Cluniac movement. Early in the 11th century, merchants from Amalfi, near Naples, founded a hospital in Jerusalem, dedicated to John the Baptist, to provide care for sick pilgrims to the Holy Land. After the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, during the First Crusade, a group of crusaders formed this religious order to support the hospital. Just a few decades later, the village and land of Quenington was granted to the Hospitallers by Agnes de Lacy, a member of that distinguished Anglo-Norman family we have come across so often in this area. Ross and I walked with our dogs down the river toward the river and the church to find out what was left of this ancient settlement. The answer is not really very much, but what there is is exceptional. First, let's hear from our much-loved Herbert Evans.
Evans, while cycling in this area, dropped down on his bicycle from Hatherop Castle, just behind us, into this lovely village of Quenington. And he describes coming down the hill towards this amazing archway. And this is what he says. We joined the river again at Quenington, just by the bridge. And that tall and venerable building on the right, close to Quenington Bridge, with its high-pitched roof, canopied niche and postern door, is the gatehouse of a preceptory of the Knights of St. John. The community was a small one, 2 knights only and a preceptor, as we learn from a report made to the Grand Master of the Order in 1338 by Prior Philip of Tame. Nothing else remains to mark their dwelling but a part of the moat which formerly surrounded it, together with the adjacent church. As for the church, it has suffered much and long, but still retains 2 of the finest Norman doorways in Gloucestershire, and that is all that need be said of it. At the dissolution, when the Hospitallers went the way of the other religious orders, their estates were granted to Anthony Kingston, that scourge of the king's enemies, whom we shall meet again in the next chapter. That's true of Evans, but you may remember we've heard about him before. He's the man who set up a hanging field near Painswick. I'm sure those of you who watch our stuff will have remembered him.
Now, a word in a little more detail about these truly extraordinary Norman church doors. Firstly, the fact that there are 2, both north and south, is exceptional. But their extraordinary storytelling carvings make them unique, at least in the limited experience of your Cotswold explorer. The north door is covered in chevrons, roll moulding, limpet shells, green men and flowers, all traditional features of Norman doorways, but rarely, if ever, in such profusion in one place. And the central tympanum is carved to portray the story from the Gospel of Nicodemus, which tells of the harrowing of hell. It shows Christ piercing the bound figure of Satan with a cross, whilst 3 souls rise from the head of a serpent, symbolizing the jaws of hell. The image of the sun, with a face in it, is also unusual, although I'm told something similar can be found in Peterborough Cathedral. If anything, the south doorway is even more remarkable. Probably by a different hand, and perhaps rather less accomplished, the doorway is just as elaborate, using every space for decoration, and the tympanum in this case is filled with an image of 4 evangelists and 2 seraphim. The subject is the coronation of the Virgin, who is seated by the side of Christ as he crowns her. She seems to be holding a dove. After these extraordinary doors, the inside of the church, as predicted by Evans, is a bit of a disappointment. How much has been lost over the years, much of it at the hands of F.S. Waller and Son in the 1880s, is demonstrated by the many 12th and 13th century carved stones set into the walls, both north and south. The late 16th century plain octagonal font is pleasant enough, but lacks any ornamentation or decoration. And the glass and even the monuments fail to excite. Perhaps it's the contrast to these extraordinary doors. Right outside are 2 rather wonderful 17th century chest tombs with spiral bale tops and carved lyre ends. Leaving the church, the old rectory opposite sits in a highly enviable position on the river, with gardens on both sides joined with a neat bridge. Some very exciting things happen in this wonderful house, which I hope we'll be able to return to tell you about in a few months' time.
I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Quenington. It's a lovely little village. It's an interesting example of the Cotswold village that has expanded quite a lot around its edges. Clearly the community is a very successful one, but the core of the village remains just as wonderful. The church doors really are remarkable, and they're definitely worth coming to see. If ever you're lucky enough, and I doubt you ever will be, to see the River Colne in this state of flood, then it's definitely worth coming. But I suppose on behalf of the residents of this place, and indeed many other places on this river, we better hope that that doesn't happen. It's been great fun for us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can find us on all the normal platforms. Have a look at our website, thecotswoldexplorer.co.uk, where you'll find lots more information about our programmes. I've enjoyed Evans's comments, and of course we've followed him with enormous enthusiasm for several years. I've spent a while now recording an audiobook of this wonderful guide. It'll be available quite soon. Look at the link at the bottom of the screen and feel free to buy a copy if you would like to.
A little jinx west-northwest now to Cowley Manor, where we find remains of my ancestors and a fabulous hotel being created from the manor house, built in one of the most spectacular positions in the whole Cotswold.
Now we're here for an unusual reason. This house that you see behind me is an hotel. It's recently been bought. They're spending huge amounts of money on it. They're doing it up. The very first house built on this site, however, was built by an ancestor of mine. I'm going to show you round. I'm going to show you the church in which he's buried and tell you the story of a very, very ancient ancestor of me. Come with me.
Visiting Cowley village with its large manor and the small pretty church has turned out to be a rather startling revelation to me. At the risk of making it all a little too personal, and certainly more personal than normal, I'll tell you the story as it happened. Evans, when visiting this place on his travels in 1905, related a tale about the church, which I will now read to you. The small Norman church to the east of the large modern manor house with its terraced gardens overlooking an ornamental lake conforms to the Cotswold type. The east end is lighted by two small windows in the gable, one above the other, and the wall below is blank. The perpendicular tower and porch appear to be the only later additions. The former contains a peal of 6 bells, presented by the squire of Queen Anne's day, who was a devotee of campanology, and used to travel about the country with a company of bell ringers, till at last he had wrung away his fortune. A small story, but one, if you will forgive the pun, which rang a bell with me. It was only years after I read that, and when I came to the church and saw the name on the memorial stones in the floor, that it all came back to me. My mother's maiden name was Brett, and the graves in the floor of the church are those of members of the Brett family. I went home and looked up the excellent history of the Bretts written by my cousin Christopher Brett, the 5th Viscount Esher, and this is the passage I found. Henry lived the peaceful life of a country gentleman for many years until he died in 1674 at the age of 87. He and his wife Margaret, who died many years before him, were both buried in the church at Cowley, inside which their memorials can still be seen. He was succeeded by his grandson, another Henry Brett, who was only 17 at the time. This Henry, coming early to his inheritance, behaved quite differently to his grandfather. An inveterate spender, he started in 1675 by entirely rebuilding Cowley Manor House at very considerable cost. Meanwhile, he developed a passion for campanology, an extremely expensive hobby if, like him, you finance a team of bell ringers to take round the country with you and donate bells to villages that have none or not enough. By 1704, Henry was in debt, owing £1,810, and was forced to sell his estate at Hatherley, repayment of the debt being part of the consideration. In 1721, Again heavily in debt, he conveyed Cowley to his son-in-law, William Morgan of Bristol, in return for an annuity and again for the repayment of his debts. So that's where it all went. Since the days of my 18th century 7 times great-grandfather, his house has entirely disappeared, and in its place was built the substantial 19th century building you see today. It was designed by the elder George Somers Clark, who had been a pupil and assistant to James Barry. He built it for James Hutchinson, a London stockbroker, in Barry's favourite Italianate style, with extraordinary stone detailing. It was extended again between 1896 and 1902 for Sir James Horlick, he of the malt drink fame, who has been sending us all to sleep for over a century. It was Clark who took advantage of the truly astonishing site to form terraces with lakes and cascades dropping down to the River Churn in the valley below. From the great south terrace, mostly detailed by Briggs, steps and grass lead down to the upper lake. The link between this and the lower lake is made by a great wall with steps on either side, ornamented with pilasters and with fountain masks with horns and shellheads, pouring water into a water staircase and oval pool decorated with stone lions and eagles. There are substantial losses of statuary, and in particular trees, from this astonishing garden. Horlick apparently planted over 700,000 trees, but make no mistake, this is still a truly extraordinary place. In the 20th century, the manor has been a nursing home and a hotel, but recently it's been bought by a highly respected international hotel group called the Experimental Group. They've called in the spectacularly trendy designer Dorothy Meilichsen, who has worked on projects in Paris, London, Ibiza, Menorca, Venice, Basel, Monaco and New York. And I asked them what their plans were. And in the most perfect PR speak, this is what they said. Overall, we wanted to do what we love to do, a mix of geometric elements, a mix of styles, of eras, celebrating the multiple alterations of the buildings from 1695 to the 2000s. So at the end, a joyeux bordel. Our main inspiration was of course the building itself, mixing very classical inspirations as a tribute to the original manor. Blurred maple, verdigris, sophisticated rattan furniture, mixed with contemporary elements such as enamelled lava, lime walls, very graphic fabrics and carpets, fully upholstered furniture, bold colours, glossy lacquer, and a lot of checkerboard patterns. This latter a tribute to Alice in Wonderland. They tell me that Lewis Carroll wrote Alice at Cowley Manor and would have been inspired by the grounds. I hadn't heard this before, but I'm sure they're right. They tell me that they've hidden small doors, small elements from Alice on the carpets, rugs, fabrics, painted on the walls, all in different scales, even sculpted in lava. They plan to open this summer, and to be perfectly honest, I can't wait to see the results. This is such a breathtaking place that in the hands of such a distinguished designer, it will, I'm sure, be simply spectacular. Perhaps I'll take my wife there on our 51st wedding anniversary and try to imagine what it was like for my ancestor Henry, a spendthrift after my own heart, to live in such a place. Finally, we had a full 25 miles south to a busy metropolis in a fold in the western escarpment, the thriving little town of Dursley.
We're here because one of our lovely viewers recommended that we come here. I expect Mark Richards lives here, and it is quite clearly a thriving community. We've come by road from Cirencester over the hills, and as we drop down into this lovely place, we could see the Severn. But you know, it answers to a degree quite a few of you who've said there don't seem to be any people in the Cotswolds. In this town, there are definitely people. We're going to show you around. Come with me.
I suppose the truth is that for the last 5 years, Ross and I have been concentrating on the little places in the Cotswolds that most clearly demonstrate the classic feel of honey stone houses, Stonesfield slate roofs, rolling countryside with medieval churches and manor houses. We make no apology for that, but it is perhaps just a little blinkered, as so many of the population of the Cotswolds live in less than picture-perfect surroundings. Dursley has a fascinating history, which we will endeavour to outline for you, but it went through a huge demolition and rebuild in the 1950s and 60s, which gives us a really good illustration of the effects of 20th century thinking. Many planners and architects in the mid-20th century had a certain disdain for the old medieval architecture of the Cotswolds. They were fascinated with new materials, clean straight lines and simplicity of design. In Dursley they took the bulldozers to lines of cottages, whole streets of shops and municipal buildings, razing them to the ground with a view to providing simple but efficient buildings to serve the interests of businesses and the community. Their hearts were in the right place, but I fear the results of their passion in the long term was not great. I think that the one thing they really didn't predict was how badly their buildings would age. Whatever you may think of the sentimental attachment people like me have with medieval buildings, there can be no doubt that Cotswold stone ages with grace and beauty. However dilapidated the buildings become, they retain real warmth and beauty. The same cannot be said of 1960s urban architecture. As it ages, it simply looks tatty and cheap. Having said that, I really want to emphasise that this town has a buzz which is extremely hard to ignore. It is, as I've said, quite clearly a thriving community. It has been a successful town since the days of the wool trade, where, in the 16th century, it specialised in producing cloth on a broad loom, using its fuller's earth deposits to clean and prepare the wool. Subsequently, the Lister Company, manufacturer of agricultural machinery and engines, continued its successful industrial progress by setting up here. The world is, of course, changing dramatically, and the success of little towns like this is less certain than it was, but there seems to me to be no reason at all why the energy and enthusiasm that the population so clearly has shouldn't take this town into the 21st century with all the panache shown by their predecessors. And meanwhile, it still has a few undoubted treasures. Dursley lies on the south side of a deep valley, cut into the Cotswold escarpment by the fast-flowing river Uelm. The town probably stems from about the 12th century, when Roger de Berkeley founded a castle here. No trace of the castle exists, but it was probably somewhere in the northwest of the town. The market house, which sadly seems to do duty as a roundabout in the town centre, is of a familiar design. We've seen the like in many places, including the nearby Tetbury. There are a few great examples of ancient architecture dotted around the market, which give you a hint of what the original square used to look like. But the Church of St. James is a real eye-opener. It is full of treasures, and worth a visit from anyone even remotely interested in the history of ecclesiastical architecture. It has a checkered and dramatic past. Probably founded, along with the castle in the mid-12th century, on the 7th of January 1699, the spire and tower collapsed, crashing down on the heads of the bell ringers hard at work inside. Collapsing spires and towers are not unusual in these ancient buildings, partly because the builders were pushing the boundaries of their expertise to the limit, but recorded deaths from these collapses are rare. The tower was rebuilt in 1707 to 1709 to the design of Thomas Sumption of Cowley in Wiltshire, one of the last master masons to carry on with medieval traditions, largely unaffected by either Renaissance or Gothic revivalist influences. Its design, Pevsner tells us, was based on that of the 15th century tower at Cowley, with the addition of open-work battlements and pinnacles in the style of the Gloucester coronet. Further restoration took place in the 1860s by T.G. Jackson. Inside, the modern reredos from 1981 is by Tom Preter, as is the lovely statue in wood of the Madonna and Child from a decade-odd earlier. The octagonal bowl of the font is early, probably the beginning of the 14th century, and the pulpit was designed in 1888 by Swinfen Harris, as were the choir stalls. Around the same time, but in a totally different style, the organ case was designed and built by Dr. Arthur Hill. The great east window over the altar was made in around 1880 and features an interesting Flemish landscape. All the windows are fascinating to examine, mostly made in the late 19th and early 20th century by a list of some of the most distinguished glassmakers in the area. Now, I can't help being ghoulishly fascinated by the effigy on the windowsill of the Tanner Chapel. The chapel named, incidentally, after a mid-15th century merchant, which is one of those sinister cadaver sculptures we've come across before. Now, try as I might, I can't work out the reason why anyone should decide to carve a monument by depicting a long-dead body. I haven't researched it, and I probably won't, preferring on this occasion to continue speculating. This one is minus its head, which somehow makes it even more weird. In an age when it's considered a sin to say or do anything to upset anyone else, this really does seem wonderfully gruesome. I love it. There are lots of lovely wall tablets to decipher, and I can tell you that an hour spent in this lovely church is very far from a wasted one. The outskirts of Dursley have lots of interesting buildings, but of course the hills around this town are full of the most wonderful walks. This is, after all, the western escarpment of the Cotswolds, looking directly over the valley of the River Severn, and the views are truly second to none. This place has been a very nice surprise.
I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Dursley. It's a little bit different from what we've normally done, but Mark, we're very grateful to you for pointing us in this direction. The church is an absolute treasure. Extraordinary building and full of wonderful things. It has been an extraordinary experience. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can find us on all the normal platforms. Look for our website, thecotswoldexplorer.co.uk, where you can find out more about all the things we've done. And we will see you very soon somewhere else in the Cotswolds.